Can you hear us, Tom?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. So I am the chair of the next session. Let me introduce our next speaker, who's Tom Hoogervorst from Leiden. Tom is a comparative linguist and specialist on Austronesian languages. Tom Hoogervorst is a kind of octopus working on many fields, like the history of food history, basically, food history of Southeast Asia. Tom is also working on loanwords, especially from Indic languages, loanwords into Indonesian languages, from Prakrit, Sanskrit, and other Indic languages. Tom is also publishing. Tom's been publishing on animals in Javanese and generally Indo-Malay history, especially for the early modern and colonial period. And his contribution is now on mythological bird names in Austronesian languages. So the field is yours, Tom.
Okay, thanks. And also, I must apologize for not being able to attend this conference on site. My time zone, unfortunately, only allows me to participate from what I imagine would be late afternoon for most of you. But thanks for thinking of me as a stray linguist interested in what words and lexical borrowing can tell us about the past. Most of my published work, in fact, has attempted to do precisely that, with a focus, as Jiri said, on plants and boats. But now that Jiri and I are also bringing together our historical, linguistic, and philological insights on domestic animals, it would seem a not entirely illogical step to now also try my hand at the ornithological landscape of ancient and not so ancient Southeast Asia. Let me see if I can try to share what passes for a presentation. Okay, yeah, is it more or less visible to all of you?
Yes, it's fine. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I'll be looking specifically at the western part of maritime Southeast Asia, the part I'm most familiar with. And this is also the region longest and most directly in contact with South Asia and other parts of the Indian Ocean world. And these exchanges in bird nomenclature are a key element of my talk today. As for bird names in eastern Indonesia, I already spotted Gregory IV among the participants today, so I gladly defer to his long expertise on this topic. And I should also say today's talk is based on my scattered notes on loanwords, from which I gathered anything bird related for the purposes of this conference. And the result is a series of snapshots on imported birds, both real and mythical, which opens up all sorts of questions. Perhaps most importantly, what is a bird? And I imagine this might be something we're all struggling with to some extent. Now, but first, let me start with an easier question. How do people name birds? And we can take English as an example. The first possibility is a descriptive type of name, which could be about the behavior or appearance of the bird in question: the wader, roadrunner, the oxpecker, the weaver, the honeybird, the woodpecker, etc. And in other cases, the word reflects the sound the bird makes: the cuckoo, the crow, the kookaburra, but also the pigeon, discussed earlier today by Jiri, whose English name goes back to the Latin word pipiare, to chirp. And that brings me to the next topic. Bird names could be inherited, for example, from Proto-Germanic in the case of English, but they could also be borrowed from a language in contact. So the pigeon in English is from Latin, the parrot from French, the kiwi from Maori, and even the gull turns out to be from Celtic. And finally, in the case of large-scale population movements, the birds of new lands may be named after familiar birds back home. So the penguin originally denoted a northern hemisphere type of seabird, whereas the magpie, as Jara Sastrawan and other Antipodean colleagues might confirm, means something quite different in Australia as it does in England. So I also talk about mythology a bit, but it needs to be borne in mind that I'm not necessarily here to depict Indonesia as a place steeped in tradition. English, again, exhibits several bird names inspired by ancient mythology. the harpy eagle, the great argus, the griffon vulture, the Horace swift, the calliope hummingbird, etc. And my question just now, what is a bird, becomes pertinent in view of the very many bird-human creatures, or birds with teeth, and other fictional entities we see in ancient Southeast Asia, but also practically every other part of the world. I need only mention the phoenix and the griffin. Now, in terms of sources, I consider both classical texts and iconography to be informative of the relation between birds and bird-like creatures, and the words that were used, or most likely used, to designate them. But I'm also interested in loanword trajectories and the distribution of certain bird names across ethno-linguistic boundaries. And this could be because specific birds were from a specific place and everybody just took over their existing name, as the example of the kiwi from New Zealand. But lexical borrowing can also take place as part of a broader process of cultural contact. And I should also underline the multi-directionality of these processes. Southeast Asia is often depicted as a receptacle of foreign influences, but the transcontinental spread of Malay words like nuri for a type of parrot, or kasuari or cockatoo, as in Alex West's presentation, reveals the impact of Southeast Asia's ornithological landscape on the wider world. And this is not to deny the unequal power relations, of course, nor the depletion of natural resources in the interest of financial gain. But, well, on a linguistic level, as colleagues like Robert Blust have made clear, there are very few bird names that can be reconstructed to a high level of the Austronesian language family. In other words, bird names were typically not very archaic and could easily be replaced in Southeast Asia. And we also know that across cultures, there's a connection between birds and the supernatural, if only because their ability to fly enables them to reach places not accessible to humans, heaven, for example, or distant islands. And I suspect this explains the high occurrence of bird names from especially Sanskrit in the languages of Western maritime Southeast Asia. And religious contact seems to have led to the adoption of bird names, in particular birds with some sort of supernatural salience. And even the Sanskrit word for bird itself, pakshi, is found in several local languages of Southeast Asia, as well as many mainland Southeast Asian languages. In this presentation, I'll make comparisons with Thai, Khmer, and Burmese where necessary. And in fact, it deserves to be pointed out that bird names also travel within Southeast Asia without the need for some cosmopolitan culture from overseas. I already mentioned the Malay origins of several parrot-like birds, and in addition, the words for peacock, bird of prey, vulture are some common examples of bird names found across different language families in Southeast Asia. And in addition, the generic word for bird in Mon Khmer languages, the mainland, which is chim or chichim, has spread to some Austronesian languages such as Cham and Achenese, also due to language contact. Now we can take a short journey into the mythological. If one reads certain classical texts, there are quite some bird names from Sanskrit. We go to the following slide. In Old Javanese, in the Old Javanese Mahabharata, we see the bird Barunda. Ramayana has Lomasha, Shokchaka. And it would seem to me that few people in Southeast Asia had any notion of what these birds were, since they were literally adopted from the Sanskrit originals and didn't, to my knowledge, make it into iconography. But in India, as seen on the slide, Bharunda was either some sort of two-headed vulture or a generic terrible monster, sometimes bird, sometimes not. And in the same way, literary Malay and Achenese apparently had a heavenly bird known as Bayu, from the Sanskrit word vayu for wind, but I've only ever found them in old texts. So there's no telling what we're dealing with here. This is basically a sort of generic theme when one is dealing with archaic texts. We don't really quite know. But the more interesting part, at least to me, are semantic shifts, as we call them in linguistics. That is, changes in the meaning of a word. Case in point, the names of legendary animals from India that became common, mundane animals in Indonesia. Give a couple of examples. So there is the makara, a legendary sea creature in Hindu mythology, which has now become the word for lobster in Malay. And this seems to be the same with birds. We have the Sanskrit word panjavarna, or multicolored, and it denotes several different bird species in Malay. We have the Sanskrit word chanchala, which means quivering or unsteady, but it now refers to a specific bird that is known as the crazy bird in Malay, which you can see on the slide. Doesn't look that crazy to me. I was also interested in the opposite development. Would it be possible that the names of common birds from the Indian subcontinent became mythical creatures in Indonesia? I think the answer is yes. For one thing, Malay mythology has the burung cempaka, which is fabled to live on raindrops. Now, etymologically, I suspect this is nothing more than the Jacobin cuckoo depicted on the slide, which is ultimately from Sanskrit jataka. And similarly, some classical texts in Acehnese, which is the language of northern Sumatra, have the word kanka in the meaning of a mythical bird and or winged serpent. And this is very likely the Sanskrit word kanka for a common heron, which is quite brilliant because now I can't stop seeing herons as flying snakes. And as I said, I was also interested in comparisons with the Southeast Asian mainland. On first sight, there are not too many similarities. However, some of the common mythological birds or bird-like creatures in Thai, Khmer, Burmese traditions are also found in Old Javanese. The examples I found of, say, pan-Southeast Asian Indic birds are Shakuna, Vihaga, Kinara. You can see the latter depicted on the slide, left on a Borobudur relief and right on in the iconographic style of Thailand. And in all cases, these words seem to designate supernatural birds or bird hybrids. And I know this panel also has a talk by Stacey Jung about the Karavika bird, but I haven't found that particular one anywhere in maritime Southeast Asia, but I might stand corrected. Now, in my earlier research, I've already noticed the presence of certain Indic words in Southeast Asian languages that appear to have been borrowed from spoken languages or Prakrit, rather than Sanskrit, which was the elite language of scholars. And possible examples I've come across, going to the next slide, are Rajawali, which is a kind of eagle, Gurundaya in Javanese, which is a swallow, Merpati, which is dove. It's very widespread in Western Southeast Asia. And so vernacular languages also played a role, but why exactly these words were borrowed remains speculative. Now, and I don't want to sound like a smug sort of ivory tower academic, but I would like to re-evaluate birdness, because if we look at Indianized iconography from Southeast Asia, we see realistic birds representing, in fact, the region's rich bird life. One example are some of the Borobudur reliefs, which interestingly also depict some species from the Eastern archipelago. And the other example are mythical birds, so bird-like hybrids, in which an interesting subcategory consists of the birds as the mount or Vahana in Sanskrit, of a deity. And these birds are often anthropomorphized. So in other words, they look a bit human. Let's go to a classic example that we probably have all seen at one point. This is the Vimana, which in India denotes a mythical flying sort of chariot. But in Java, it's become Vilmana, a sort of a huge bird slash man slash taxi. And I suspect this development is also partly linguistic, as the word will means demon or giant in Old Javanese. So it's being reinterpreted in iconography, it seems. And what we also see is that these humanoid characteristics can be removed or at least reduced in Indonesia, while they're still found in India and mainland Southeast Asia. For example, going to, this is it. Well, there is Hansa, which is the legendary bird on which Brahma rode, which became the common word for goose in Indonesia, so became devoid of any mythological associations. Then we have Garuda, the mount of Vishnu, which in at least some Indonesian and Philippine contexts additionally referred to local eagle species, as can also be seen on Indonesia's national emblem. And finally, we have Jatayu, the king of vultures, which also became the generic term for a vulture in modern Javanese. But I should add that large birds of prey, by virtue of being large birds of prey, never really lose their supernatural associations. Because for one thing, they could fly higher than anybody else, and therefore they were the closest thing to heaven until the invention of modern air jets, although vultures in particular can fly almost as high as an airplane. But to return to the, what I think, irrefutable idea that birds are nothing more than reptiles with wings, there are a couple of common sort of bird-like snakes in Indonesian mythology. So in Java and Bali, we have the Ardawalika, which interestingly features in local retellings of the Mahabharata, an Indic text, including in the associated wayang and other iconography. But to my knowledge, you don't find this particular one in India or mainland Southeast Asia. On the slides, you see one depicted in the Balinese tradition. There is also the so-called milun in classical Malay and Achenese tales, which according to its description strikes me as something similar. I don't think anybody's written about this particular animal, the milun, which people now are no longer familiar with. So again, some sort of bird-like thing that obviously existed in the past. We don't really know what it is now. And finally, I would entertain the possibility that the legendary salamander of Persian mythology and its Malay translations, and by the way, the salamander is not technically a reptile, although they kind of look like lizards, they may have been reinterpreted as yet another bird in the Indonesian archipelago, because salamanders don't really occur anywhere in Southeast Asia except very close to the Chinese border. So it was really up to the audiences of translated Persian tales what to make of them. And on the topic of early Islamic portrayals of birds in maritime Southeast Asia, I, of course, defer to Ellen Nyoto, who's, I think, also here in the room. And just a couple of comments from my side from the perspective of language and literature. The Persian simurg, let me just get a picture of it real quick. Yeah, here it is. I think roughly corresponds to the anka bird in Arabic mythology, and it is also used interchangeably in Malay literature with the Indic Garuda, the local burung pingai. And several scholars have actually pointed this out before me, that these bird names are used interchangeably. They've become synonyms, although they come from different linguistic sources. Again, this is not an identifiable species, but a wondrous bird of legends. On the slide, you see examples of the Persian version. And just now I pointed out that a number of Sanskrit-derived bird names only exist in Old Javanese translations of Indic tales. This is the same with some Arabic-derived bird names. We get to the next slide. Some Arabic-derived bird names in the Malay literature, such as the hudud, as depicted on the slide. This is a bird not known in maritime Southeast Asia, although you do find it on the mainland. And the akab, which is eagle. And again, you only find these birds in translated works from Arabic. Now, I also found what I imagine is either an interesting confusion or a deliberate wordplay. Classical Malay texts such as the Surat al-Anbiya and Bustan al-Salatin exhibit the Arabic-derived term Tayr al-Nasr, which would translate as the eagle bird or the vulture bird. But this word appears to have become Tayr al-Basir in other texts, which would translate as the news-bringing bird. So there might be a pun going on, because this again corresponds to a very common association in Southeast Asia as well as worldwide, that birds are the bringers of news, as they can travel, between different realms, essentially. And of course, we also see bird hybrids showing up in Islamic or Islamicized traditions. So this is the burak of Islamic tradition, which was originally imagined as a winged horse, but several West Indonesian traditions call the animal a bird. So, for example, the burung burak. And again, the type of animal that warrants the designation of a bird differs across ethno-linguistic communities, and the ability to fly is often decisive. I haven't actually found any pictures of Southeast Asian buraks reimagined as birds, nor does it seem to have been the dominant way of depicting them. On the slide, for example, you see a sculpture from the southern Philippines, which doesn't really look bird-like except the wings. Now, finally, I want to pull us out of the realm of legends and back into the zoological world, because contact with Muslim communities across the Indian Ocean also introduced some actual new birds, or at least knowledge thereof, products. The ostrich was named the camel bird across South and Southeast Asia. And this loan translation is also seen, for example, in Malay, burung unta. In addition, the Arabic loanword na'am also made its way into Southeast Asia, as seen in early dictionaries. Now, in colonial times, just to mention briefly another example, we have the turkey, among a number of other birds that was introduced into the region. And this animal, as you know, is typically named after some distant part of the world, like Turkey. In some Malay varieties, it was named kalkun after the Dutch, who in turn named it after the South Indian port of Calicut. In others, it was known as Peru, apparently after the South American nation, as was the case in India as well. But the default name in Malay was ayam Belanda, which translates as Dutch chicken. Here I can also make a short excursion to East Indonesia, because at those places where the Portuguese established a presence, we see some Portuguese-derived bird names such as pombo for dove, masariku for the type of short bird you see depicted. And finally, in terms of possible Chinese influence on maritime Southeast Asian bird names, I have found almost nothing. just two examples, which is, well, in the Batik of Java's north coast, as you can see on the slide, there's a bird known as burung hok, bird of luck, which strikes me as a mythological species. And some Indonesian languages also have the Chinese loanword kaleng for a type of starling depicted on the left, which interestingly is also found in the Thai language. So maybe they were particularly popular among Chinese bird aficionados, but again, this is speculation. So in conclusion, I think we can say the following things. First of all, bird naming practices of Western maritime Southeast Asia were relatively innovative, featuring several word replacements as a result of different layers of cultural contact. I've also called attention to the realm of mythology versus scientifically attested bird species. But as the case studies presented here make clear, the categories are somewhat fluid, and the names of birds often move from the mythological to the mundane and vice versa. So what is a bird? I think it's fair to say that birdness also included certain types of reptiles, mammals, including humans, and also deities that simply chose to manifest themselves as birds. And as such, bird naming practices tell us something about Austronesian linguistics, as well as Southeast Asian mythology, imported or otherwise. And both need to be taken into account to understand where ornithological terms come from and how they change over time. And I think with this, I must conclude in anticipation of your questions and comments. So thanks again.
Thank you, Tom, for this really wonderful presentation. I see that the linguist's excursion to the bird world was more than successful, and I'm quite sure there will be a couple of questions. I may be the first to pose one short question, or probably one short comment. You say that lomasha is one of the Sanskrit loans used for birds, which identity is not known. Of course, it's absolutely true. And I may add that the word occurs in the Kunjarakarna Kakavin, the 14th century Buddhist poem in Old Javanese, where it refers to iron birds that are part of hellish fauna to torment sinners. So basically, this may be one of the clues that these mythological birds were adopted for situations for which, of course, non-local bird was probably as fitting as imported bird name, but that's my speculation. But the word is attested in this context. And Radu reminds me that we should probably have the second speaker now, and after that the questions, right? Yeah. So now let me introduce. That's not my chair.
So because Stacey's not
Okay.
Well, why don't we go ahead and do the questions, because our talks are not even closely related.
Okay, sorry for inconvenience, but our next speaker, Stacy Jung, is not probably online. So basically, I would like to invite you to pose questions pertaining to Tom's presentation first, and then we go to the next panel headed by Ellen Nyoto, where Marta is the first speaker. So, Tom, back to my questions. Now I am quite happy to place several of them. What I find particularly fascinating is this double stream exchange, that we also do have Prakrit words actually applied for Austronesian birds. And you give us example of Gurundaya, which is really wonderful. It's quite striking discovery because Gurundaya's, if I'm mistaken, please correct me. It's one of the names for swifts, rock swifts or swiftlets, right? Swallows, basically. And may this imply that, because as I read it as a non-linguist, Prakrit words were used by, let's say, Indian traders or Indian business participants, mariners, shippers, while Sanskrit words, Sanskrit loans would point to the context of textual transmission of the word. So in the case of Gurundaya, should we suppose that birds like swiftlets were introduced by Indians to Java, which anyway can be not improbable, because if you consider that the bird has been harvested for its nests for at least the last 1,000 years, if not more, especially in China, then it would make a kind of sense to introduce a kind of nest producing swiftlet as actual bird species. Do you have any can you develop on this idea?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And also for the identity of Lomasha, which I didn't know this text, but it's certainly a very important finding that they would be part of a hellish fauna. So again, it's basically also the answer to your second question. For me, the mystery is I don't quite know what it means in the Indic setting. So let's say the donor culture, if you will, because we basically use a Sanskrit dictionary and then it says a type of bird, right? So this is a bit of a problem. This is the same with the Gurundaya, by the way, which indeed means a sort of swallow, swiftlet type of animal, but we have no idea what it means in Indian languages, because again, all the dictionaries simply say a type of bird. So in this regard, I think the Southeast Asian sort of birdscapes, if you will, are slightly better documented than the ones in India. So this is a bit of a problem. Now, as for your question, I don't think there's necessarily a one-to-one correspondence between the, let's say, geographical origins of a word and those of the thing it denotes. For example, a lot of Indonesian spices also have Sanskrit names, like the pala for nutmeg and a couple of other ones, even though they're obviously traveling in the opposite direction. I think with birds as well, there might be a tendency to use a sort of more cosmopolitan Indic term for something local. And one only does that when the bird itself is something, say, of distinction, something special. And this might be where your bird nests come in. The moment it becomes a prestigious, say, trade product, I can imagine the name changes as well, as happened for, say, the aromatic woods in Southeast Asia, the spices, all of that. Now, the final point, I have a bit of trouble at this moment believing that Prakrit loanwords were introduced by traders and Sanskrit by, let's say, scholars. I think it is very possible for a trader to be simultaneously a scholar. So I don't see any point to assume that these were different groups of people. May have been the same people who just happened to speak multiple languages. But then again, me saying so would probably directly attack, let's say, 200 years of scholarship on the introduction of Indian religions in Indonesia. So that's slightly, a more tricky topic to tackle here. But I think that not necessarily were two communities involved in the introduction. May have been the same people who just happened to slip in their sort of mother tongue occasionally, while also maybe speaking Sanskrit as well. So I guess that would answer your second question.
Yeah, that's a good point. That explains a lot. And by the way, is dadali the common Javanese word for swallow now? Is it Austronesian word or loanword? Possibly no.
Well, it's one of the many examples. So I mentioned just now the bird naming practices in let's say the Western Maritime Southeast Asia archipelago are very, very innovative. They change all the time, so it's almost impossible to reconstruct a lot of Austronesian bird names. I mean, Robert Blust had maybe 20 of them, which is almost nothing if you compare it with other language families, specifically because birds don't really care about biological borders such as the Wallace line. So you would expect them to be older, but they're not. And nobody really knows why.
Great. And then I cannot resist to pose the question about Chataka, because this bird perplexes all Javanese scholars for decades, if not more than 150 years. You link it to Chantaka, this Jacobin kaku that you've shown us the picture of the bird. Do we know the biological identity of Chataka in Sanskrit basically, or in India, or?
Yeah, we know it in India, but then again, Sanskrit is always a bit mysterious because it could be used, in different times for different species. But in most of the Sanskrit-derived, let's say, languages that I know of, and also in Tamil, I think, as a loan word, it means this bird that was just depicted. Now, it's always a bit dangerous to extrapolate things from modern languages and say this must have been the case in old languages. I mean, as you know, this is the problem for old Javanese as well. But I do think, I mean, the important thing here to notice is that in modern South Asia, it is a very sort of common, let's say, bird, and you could point it out and say, there's one. Same, by the way, with the kokila, which is an identifiable species in South Asia. And in Southeast Asia, it's sort of, I mean, in many languages enters the realm of the mythical, the mythological, as in it seems to obtain all sorts of supernatural connotations that it didn't have in South Asia, or maybe not anymore, but historically, maybe there were similar type of stories. This is very difficult to check or prove, of course, but the interesting part to me is that in some regions, it's still a legendary species, and in others, it's, well, basically just a common bird. And that to me would tell me that a bird could be supernatural somewhere and mundane somewhere else. I think that's the point that was, well, trying to make.
Yeah, that's quite revealing discovery, in fact. And few people discussed birds in this environment of linguistic birdscape, actually. So what you do is really a novel, in my view. Actually, it's really completely novel research, because few people did have a look on bird names, Sanskrit bird names as used in Indonesia, and all Javanese bird names as used in Javanese environment, basically. So please keep going on. It's really
well. Thanks, but you've immediately also laid bare the weakness, which is if you don't know a lot of texts, especially from India, you're sort of facing a lot of dead ends as well. So in a way, at one point, there will have to be another sort of collaboration between a philologist, you, for example, and then a linguist. But yeah, it is basically a puzzle piece, and then text will be a additional one.
I hope there are some other questions. Ellen?
Can you hear me? It is a related question, so maybe I'll go ahead. There are other questions in the room. Hi, Tom. It was really such a pleasure to hear you. And it is indeed quite, I think, groundbreaking. At least it answers quite a few questions we were, in fact, wondering about in the elevator just now. How to extend, not that it's my role to do this, but I guess we're going to have, at the end of tomorrow's day, a discussion about this, about the relevance of this topic and how to extend it maybe to other speakers. We were wondering, so sorry, just a shortcut. I really love how you show that, as you just repeated, how mundane, real birds had as much importance as mythical ones, or legendary or supernatural, how you call them. How a bird, as you like to redefine it, could have, so basically it had a common denominator, right? It could be anything with wings, but also trunks, tusk, fangs, claws, the body of a bull. So basically, kala, makara, naga could be birds as well. And I really love how this is suddenly the definition has exploded completely in just one presentation. So which boils down to asking the question: is looking at birds in Southeast Asia relevant at all? I guess it is relevant if we expand for Southeast Asia. If we expand this definition, indeed, I mean it's quite impossible to not look at the supernatural. So maybe a solution could be, birds natural and supernatural, or something like that to extend it, to expand it. So it was more of a comment, but of course I have many questions, but I'm not sure. Do we have time for another question?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Could you develop a little bit more? I'm sorry I missed. I'm a little bit tired and my brain's not functioning very well today. Could you expand a little bit about this Simurg, Anka, Garuda, and Burung Pingi? Did you explain that Garuda was a translation that authors would find for Simurg and Anka from Arabic? Well, Simurg from Persian, Anka Arabic, and Garuda in where, Malaysia, I think so.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just start with the second question. Sometimes, yes, it would be a translation. So you would have a text with different, let's say, versions. And for example, the Javanese version would have one word, the Malay version would have the other. Sometimes even within a text, let's say different manuscripts of the same text, one manuscript would have one word, one would have the other. This seems to have been the case not just in languages such as Malay and Javanese, but also already in, say, West Asia, in which, for example, Persian authors would use Anka and Simurg simultaneously. And I think this also has to do with this multiple layers of cultural influence in which people had to essentially recategorize what different concepts meant, what different words. Does this go into the same drawer as something we already have, or should we make an additional category? And this is, I guess, an ongoing process. It's sort of also your first remark about the importance, if any, of talking about birds in Southeast Asia. And I think you've already said it yourself. This sort of fluid categories and recategorizations would strike me as the key thing to keep in mind, especially because it's also ongoing. Still, as you say, something with wings is likely to be interpreted as a bird. And in fact, I remember a paper by Gregory Forth saying that in East Indonesia, and I've also seen this personally, bats are categorized as birds because they fly. And so the zoological definition sort of falls short in understanding birdness in Southeast Asia. There's also certain things. I mean, one of my favorite examples is, as you know, there is a Javanese community in Suriname, and Suriname has a completely different fauna, of course, and they have hummingbirds, for example, the very tiny ones that could sort of fly like a little helicopter. And the word they use for that is the same word of a type of insect that you have in Indonesia. So some animal could also be sort of kicked out of the category of birds and become an insect. So it's this entire sort of notion of fluidity that I think, well, would interest me the most. But sometimes, I mean, if I also understand where your question is coming from, if there's no clear, let's say, definition of a bird, can we at all talk about it, right? Because I'm thinking about, one of the things that I think Yiri is also working on is this whole idea of furniture, and you as well, I think, furniture in Southeast Asia, which is a concept of us now. It wasn't a concept of people in Southeast Asia then. I still think we can talk about it productively as long as we make these sort of different interpretations a crucial part of what we're doing. I think if we do that, it might even become interesting.
I was more, I mean, I completely agree with what we're doing here is redefining, and it's very much needed as is quite a newer topic, but I was more, praising the way that, how this conference is going from a rather how I understood it, a naturalistic approach towards a more, mythological one, and to include the supernatural. It seems more and more important to include it. There was another question.
Hello, Tom. I come from the background of East Asian art history. So I noticed that Kalavinka appears in your list of mythological bird names. And because in Chinese and Japanese Buddhist art, Kalavinka is a very important motif. So I'm wondering whether, like, from your own research perspective, could you elaborate, or I don't know whether there were some connections between the Kalavinka and Chinese and Japanese Buddhist art in your cases? And also because the Chinese term for the Kalavinka, one term is connected with music, because Kalavinka is supposed to be the musician or the musician bird. So I'm wondering, in Austronesian languages, like in that system, is that also related to music? Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Just writing down your question. So the thing about Kalavinka is that I haven't really found it in Indonesia or the Philippines. I did find it a lot in Burmese art, iconography, Thailand, Cambodia, and typically in a Buddhist context, as would be the same in China and Japan, I reckon, but with huge regional differences as well. So in the Burmese art, it looks like a half human, half bird, and then there would be traditions in which it looks more bird-like, and there would be traditions in which it doesn't look like a bird at all. So, interesting overlap also with Elaine's question. But the tricky thing for me is that if it is Buddhist, I would expect to find it in medieval Java as well, for example, on the Borobudur. And it might still be the case that I haven't looked well enough. But the link with music, it might be my own sort of unawareness, but I haven't really seen it in mainland Southeast Asia. That doesn't say a lot, because I haven't looked at mainland Southeast Asia in detail. So it may very well be possible that you'd also find it in a place like Thailand, for example. It wouldn't surprise me at all, actually, but there's just too many regional differences, too many temporal differences to give a sort of universal answer. It's a very good question, but I simply don't really know. I mean, I hope somebody else can inform you, somebody with more knowledge about the Southeast Asian mainland.
Thank you